Haere mai, and welcome to Cult Chat, the podcast where we talk about coercion, control, and all things cultish. I'm Dr. Caroline Ansley. I'm a medical doctor. As a child, I lived at the Centrepoint community, a notorious cult in New Zealand, and now I run a website that advocates for the former children of the community.
I'm Liz Gregory, and I run the Glory of Our Leavers Support Trust, and I'm privileged to walk alongside people after leaving this group as they embark on their new lives.
And I'm Lindy Jacob. I'm a former member of the Exclusive Brethren, and I'm part of the Olive Leaf Network, a new initiative in Aotearoa to support leavers of high-demand religious groups. Come with us as we unpack the cult playbook. We'll be talking to experts and leavers of coercively controlling groups, and we will call for Kiwis to cult-proof their lives.
Come with us as we traverse the cultiverse.
A warning, this podcast contains references to subjects and discussions which may be difficult for some people to hear. Please take care of yourselves and your whānau when listening.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cult Chat. I'm Kaz, and I am really looking forward to today's conversation. I'm talking to Willow Duffy about child safety in organisational contexts. So Willow and I are going to have a chat about how we can protect children in institutions or organisations, and then we'll be joined by Liz and Lindy to get their thoughts on the conversation. Willow is co-founder and CEO of Safeguarding Children, a national child welfare service. She specialises in creating child-safe organisations. She leads a team that has developed and delivered child protection trainings and consultancy to over 90,000 frontline children workers in New Zealand. Willow sits on a number of advisory and expert groups in relation to child protection and safeguarding. Her expert knowledge in protecting children from abuse and neglect was gained on the front line working as a nurse, midwife practitioner, specialist community public health nurse practitioner, and child protection supervisor in the UK, and enrolled as a child abuse assessment and treatment nurse, sexual health nurse, and a well child nurse in New Zealand. Tēnā koe, Willow. It's great to have you here.
Lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you today.
Yeah, I'm quite impressed by your expertise there. I feel really quite kind of privileged to have such an experienced clinician with me in this conversation. So it's so wonderful to have you talking on this topic with us. Could you tell us a little bit more about yourself, anything that I haven't already mentioned, and how you came to be doing this really important work?
I think one of the first exposures really or experiences I had in relation to protecting children from harm was having child protection training when I was a student nurse, and again when I was a student midwife as well. I had that basic level of training, and then as I progressed through my career and became a specialist community public health nurse, or a health visitor as it's called in the UK, preventing, recognising, responding to abuse and neglect was a key part of the role. And that involved working in partnership with parents, with families, sometimes with the children as well, but generally it was children under 5 that I worked with, but also working in collaboration and partnership with lots of other agencies as well. So lots of working within a multidisciplinary team to keep children safe. And one of the main events really that made me interested in child protection, and also almost the psychology within organisations when there are concerned, was the case of Victoria Climbié in the UK, which was many years ago now. It was in the early 2000s, and Victoria was killed by people that were even her parents. They masqueraded as her parents. It was a very famous case, and in actual fact, what happened to Victoria and the result of what happened to Victoria from the Lord Lammin inquiry and the publication of guidance and documents called Every Child Matters, that sort of changed the world, and it impacted in lots of places in the world, and it also impacted in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the thing for me was that Victoria wasn't a hidden child. She was a child that was well known. She'd only been in the UK for 7 months, and 3 or 4 of those months she was actually held in a bathroom in a flat and tied up and not exposed to professionals or anybody. But during the time when she was out and about, she was really out and about. She was seen by doctors, nurses, police, social workers, in a hospital, in GP practices. And she had 128 contacts with people who had the potential to actually prevent, recognise and respond to the harm that she was experiencing. And one of the things that interested me more than anything was that she was actually repeatedly taken to a church. So she was taken to a church to be exorcised, would you believe? And the people in the church did nothing. So when they saw the terrible state that Victoria was in, and she increasingly was in a worse state, the injuries that she had were very obvious, including full face and head burns through having boiling water poured over her head and pieces of hair missing, and it was just distressing. The photographs were horrific. They didn't do anything. It was almost as though being under the umbrella or the roof of that church, that congregation did not react in the way that members of the public would. And even more interesting was that the two people who actually took absolutely strident steps to help Victoria were actually members of the public. One was the daughter of a childminder that cared for Victoria, and the other one was a taxi driver that was called to take her from the church to back home. And he said, I am not taking her back home. I'm taking her to the hospital. And she was in such a state that he couldn't even get her to the hospital, and he dropped her at an ambulance station, and Victoria died the next day. So you can imagine how she presented to that congregation, yet they did nothing. So I looked at research as to why that was, and I found some research in Spain, from Spain, that said members of the public are more likely to actually report abuse and neglect than professionals, because professionals are very often bound by policies and procedures. However, in that situation, those members of the public were part of a church. So it really, really interested me why they didn't react in the same way as they would if they'd have seen Victoria out and about in other situations.
Oh, that is fascinating, isn't it? It's tragic, but I can see why it caught your attention. Yeah, it does draw to mind my wondering what our current legal requirements and standards are here in New Zealand for, I guess as you've commented, there's a difference between the general public and those who are in a professional situation bounded by different relationships and obligations. What's it currently like here in New Zealand for those standards?
There are no child safe standards in New Zealand. So there are pieces of legislation that almost work independently of each other. So if an organisation is in receipt of government funding, so if they receive funding from the government for the services that they provide, so for example, a school or a GP practice, or even down to ECEs, and even down to sporting organisations, if they're classed as a regulated service under the Children's Act 2014, they have to have a child protection policy. And in that policy, it's to demonstrate or document what abuse looks like. So what does neglect look like? What does physical abuse look like? And the people working in the organisation who are working directly with children and are classed as core workers and also non-core workers, they have to be police vetted. And the police vet is a process whereby their identity is checked to make sure they're not under an alias or using a false name, or come from an outside country. They've come over here and they are moving countries to get away from crimes they've committed previously. And then there's the police vet, which is where the police vetting agency will check the background of the person who's applying for the role to make sure they've got no convictions, but also to make sure that the police have not got any record of any interaction with the police that hasn't necessarily resulted in a conviction, but if there is history for that person that says that they're not suitable to work with children. So that's the Children's Act, really, but that only applies to organisations that get government funding, and it doesn't apply to volunteers. And if you think about how many services and organisations exist in New Zealand to serve children, and they wouldn't exist if it wasn't for children, how many recreational, social activities and sporting activities, then the legislation that we've got doesn't actually apply. And that piece of legislation is a very weak piece of legislation that absolutely needs updating. And we started a petition to actually make changes to the Children Act to make it more robust to protect children. And that's in front of the select committees at the moment. The other piece of legislation that we've got, there is the Education Act. And within the Education Act, so education providers like schools, for example, they can police vet them volunteers. So that's people who go into the classroom to do reading and that type of thing. But that piece of legislation is only for people who work in roles during 9 till 3. So purely during the school hours. It isn't for people who are in roles outside of that. So, for example, if a school had sports coaches that ran, training sessions after school, they couldn't police vet them because it's an activity after the hours of 9 to 3. So we haven't really got that much legislation. We've obviously got the Orangutangariki Act, which is about reporting abuse and how you can do it and that type of thing. But for me, I would like to see legislation like they've got in Queensland, which is where they've actually brought in the recommendations from the Royal Commission inquiry. They've brought the principles, child safe principles, into legislation, and that was brought into legislation in December 2024. So that's one of the things that we're calling for, because Queensland found that having these principles that were voluntary principles that organisations were expected to sign up to if they were providing services for children, it didn't mean that the organisation did what they were asked to do. It's a bit like the much of the legislation in New Zealand are appealing to people's hearts and minds. So if you have a government contract, then you have to take steps to protect children. And even then, I don't believe they're effective enough. I don't believe they're robust enough. I believe that they don't cover all situations that our children are in. And the rest of the time you are appealing to people's hearts and minds, who are then trying to get people police vetted when those people are not in roles that are covered by the police vetting legislation. So it's a hodgepodge of legislation that could be better, and it should be better. Our children deserve better, and parents and carers deserve better as well.
The thing that comes to mind immediately when we use the bar of police vetting is, well, that relies on the person having come to the attention of police, doesn't it?
It does,
yes.
Yes.
So
and that's one of the flaw of it.
Yes. So if you're relying on that and you have an organisation that works extremely hard to protect people who are harming children, in fact, the organisation's priority and investment appears to be in protecting that organisation's reputation rather than the individuals in the organisation. And this is Cult Chat, so by definition, we're really examining those kinds of organisations that have that particular focus at their core. Well, it's very flawed.
It just doesn't work.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Vetting doesn't work. But also, Caroline, the police vetting doesn't work in many situations as well, because all a clear police vet means that they haven't been caught.
Exactly.
That's all it means.
That's what it means.
When we're working with organisations, and when I speak to people and I say this publicly, it is actually the references that you get from their previous employers, and more than one employer, about their suitability to work with children that's important. But again, in the situation that you're talking about, those people and those organisations are going to give good references, but that happens in the outside world as well. Somebody's not going to ask a person to give them that they know is going to give them a bad reference. And that's why we say it needs to be previous employers, not just the person that the candidate suggests. But in the situation that you're talking about, both of those don't work.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard so many different organisations accused, of moving pedophiles from one area of the organization to another. And I don't even need to name names because in my head, there's so many different organizations I can think of who
I
have
can imagine.
been accused of that very thing. Of a complaint is made, the family are shot down for it. Maybe there's some kind of challenge to the individual, and it's hushed up, and they're moved somewhere else. They're pushed out. Let's solve the problem by sending them overseas, or sending them to another congregation, or sending them somewhere else. So it's if they never come to the attention of the authorities, it's so. Moving on with my questions, there are lots coming to mind, but I want to keep this somewhat focused. Professionals who work in New Zealand with children are encouraged to report suspected child welfare concerns, but they're not mandated to. Is that correct?
So are you talking about mandatory reporting?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there isn't any mandatory reporting at the moment in New Zealand. There have been calls for it at various times, most recently from the inquest and the inquiry into the death of Malachi Subex. And in all the previous coronial inquests into the death of children in New Zealand, the coroners have all called for mandatory reporting. As a country, the sectors that make these decisions are not sure that mandatory reporting is the way forward. There are some countries in the world that do have mandatory reporting. For example, Australia has mandatory reporting, and different states have various interpretations of what that is. Some states in Australia, even members of the public have to report. They're mandated. Other places, other states, it's people who are classed as children's workers that who are mandated to report. And so the research shows that what happens is the rates of reports go up, but they're not necessarily substantiated. So when they're investigated, they don't necessarily show that there was any evidence that the child was being abused and neglected. And if you look at New Zealand, where there isn't any mandatory reporting, and look at the statistics, we're actually quite good at, making reports of concern and then being substantiated. And again, the research that I did around the time when I was, traumatized, what happened to Victoria, it showed that members of the public were just as good at reporting abuse and neglect, if not better, than people working in organisations, because they trusted their gut instinct and what they saw, and they were more inclined to actually report. So at the moment, there's lots of sort of investigation of mandatory reporting. I know that they've just brought it in, or they're about to bring it in the UK, in relation to child sexual abuse. So they're making the reporting of child sexual abuse mandatory, and that's as a result of their national inquiry. The other thing is, though, organisations can, within their own policies, make it mandatory to report child abuse and neglect. In the situations that you're talking about, I'm not sure how many cults actually have a child protection policy. And it's like all organisations, it is the culture of the organisation that trumps policy every time. So you can have all the bits of paper and all the policies, but if the people who are actually in that organisation don't believe in what you're trying to do, which is to keep children safe, or don't see a problem with what's happening to the children, then it almost becomes like a tick box exercise to actually have the policy. And there needs to be almost like an audit, an audit done to see whether or not the promises that the organisation is making actually happens in practice. And that's across organisations outside of cults as well. That same mentality continues, where they're ticking a box to say they've got a child protection policy, but believe me, it is the culture of the organisation that actually makes a difference. And that very often is down to training so people understand the impacts on children and the long-term impacts, and the fact that behaviors and beliefs can actually impact on children, and yeah, just really opening eyes and bringing across the human side of it as well. And we've worked with many organisations. We've worked with religious organisations, and the ones that are open to us working with them, or even organisations with really strong beliefs, there is some change in their beliefs and behaviours when they do understand the impact of what they've been doing on children, doing or not doing, in relation to caring with children. So I would say I always have hope that somebody in there, in the organisation, actually hears what we're saying, and it makes a difference. It just opens their eyes, a light bulb goes on, and it makes them think differently.
Well, I'm glad you've been able to find some hope, because I imagine you see a lot of situations that aren't very hopeful, actually. They're pretty...
Yeah, and do. And I have a belief in humans, and I have a belief that if you go in and build relationships, then there is the opportunity that there might be a chink. Even if it's just one person that gets the message, it can, result in some change in beliefs and behaviours. That's what keeps me going.
So you've talked about this idea of child safety culture in different organisations. Could we talk a little bit more about that? Unpack when you say you've gone into different religious organisations, and as I like to bang on about not all harmful organisations are religious. As my experience as a child was in a therapeutic community, which was not religious at all, though it was very spiritual. What can we unpack that whole culture that makes children unsafe, and maybe even compare it to a culture that has child safety at its heart? I'd like to really unpack that if possible.
I mean, for me, the first thing you've got to do is really educate about how precious childhood is. That children are not just little adults that are just a bit smaller than adults.
That was what Bert Potter said about Centrepoint. He called the children little adults.
Right, okay. And they definitely are not little adults. So really, one of the things that I found that really opens people's hearts and ears and minds is explaining childhood and what childhood is, and explaining what I learned in my roles that I've had, from conception, the wonder of conception, for example, and brain development in the first 1,000 days, and talking about things that to do with experiments that have gone on in the past, talking about attachment, because I believe that attachment is one of the key things to protecting children. It is the absolute instinct, human and animal instinct, that actually protects children. So attachment is the caregiver's response to the child's distress state. So talk about that, really educating people about the role of attachment, child development, the stages of child development, why children do things at different stages, and talking about that. And so the importance of childhood, and get them to reflect on their own childhood and their own childhood experiences. Because if they can see themselves in that situation, very often it's that situation that opens their minds a little bit, because ultimately people do like talking about themselves, and they do like thinking about themselves. And if you can get them to remember being a child, because one of the things I always say, we are all stakeholders because we've all been children. We all know what it's like to be afraid. We all know what it's like to be lonely, to not feel safe. And we all hopefully know that in that situation, you go to your attachment figures and they make you feel safe. And the response is what that does to the brain and all that type of thing. So my approach is very much along that line, coming from that, really bringing it back down to conversations, relationships, and that almost very interesting conversations where you can actually spark some interest into them. And then after that, talk about the impacts of abuse on them, and just travel that journey forward, rather than going straight in and talking about recognising and responding to child abuse and neglect. So you've got to almost, have that approach where you have that softer education that's fascinating, and be really fascinated when you're talking about it as well. Like, child development is amazing. Children are amazing. And if you can put that spark in people's minds, even the hardened people, even the people that had harsh childhoods themselves, if you can get them to see themselves in that situation, it makes a difference. Helping the organisation to see the importance of childhood, the rights of children. Very often that's quite a alien concept, because, some people don't believe that children have rights. They don't understand that children have rights. They don't necessarily understand that we've got a global piece of legislation, the United Nations Rights of the Child, and just going into that and explaining why that is important. So really just putting that message out into the organisations, the importance of childhood and what role they play in actually keeping safe, and what can go wrong if they don't keep children safe. So I would say education and training and enlightenment is actually key to it. It's actually key to it. And then from that, you can then have the other aspects of child safeguarding in there. So an organisation, for example, like a school, that's in receipt of government funding, we wouldn't say that they just needed a policy. We would say that the policy needs to be workable and robust, and it needs to be understood by everybody, even the most junior member of staff and the parents and the children. And there should be a version there that children understand, that parents understand, and the people who work there understand. And it should be something that's broadcasted so people know the standards. The other thing that is vital, Caroline, is a code of conduct. So if you think about the situations where there's no record of somebody being an abuser, very often it's their behaviours and attitudes towards children. So when you've sown the seed about how precious childhood is, then the next thing for me is a code of conduct. What is acceptable and unacceptable behaviour, and what is harmful behaviour, and what we should do if we see behaviour that is harmful, and what does that mean if we don't do something about it? So it's those types of things that are almost softer safeguarding, and also situations that I call contextual safeguarding as well. And that's where you relate it completely to the situation that the child is in, and you adapt that situation. So, for example, if a child was in a cult, the child whose parents were cult members, then it's adapting the safeguarding structures within there to actually meet the situation that the child's living in, and going to school and all of those things. So you've really got to make a bespoke culture of safeguarding. Consider all the other options.
So in my experience, like I said, I was at Centrepoint, a cult that was famous for sexualization of children from a very young age. Everything about the environment removed the child's protections and safety, isolated them, totally separated kids from protective parents, broke down attachments, and introduced non-protective adults, and opened the doors to pedophiles or predators to come in without really any consequences for them. And in fact, the culture was one that encouraged activity that to any outsider looked like predatory sexual contact, but it was socialized to be normal in that environment. So it's almost like everything that would naturally occur in a healthy environment where children are at the center, they're vulnerable, their right to all the things you mentioned in about the UN rights of the child are valued, and parents are uplifted as being the experts on their children and enabled and allowed to form good attachments. All those things were just systematically broken down to create an isolated child who was trained to behave in a way that harmed themselves and get attention or their basic psychological emotional needs met through a strategy that was rewarded but yet was very, very harmful to them. And adults around them who did try to intervene, because they did sometimes, were very much shut down, humiliated, vilified, attacked, and they were systematically robbed of their resources to leave. So I mean, you couldn't have designed a more harmful environment for children, though in fact it probably was designed, to be honest. So where do you even start? I mean, that's a terrible example of a very worst case scenario. And hopefully you're not striking too many organisations that are so systematically designed to harm children.
Like an horrific social experiment, isn't
Yes,
it?
very much so. But how do you shift some of those ingrained, multi-layered, system-wide opposite of safety strategies sort of slowly to create some grain of safety? Because it's not just about a policy, as you've already said. You can't just have a policy, hearts and minds, and you've got to be safe to call out a behaviour, right?
Exactly. Yeah. We need to be safeguarding the adults to safeguard the children.
Yes.
That's what we need to be doing. And I mean, for me in that situation, I would call on the people who have oversight of the cult, for want of a better word. So the people who do actually go into that organisation, that group, because I mean, I don't know much about Centrepoint, Caroline, but were they completely isolated, or did the children go to other places?
They went to school. I mean, this is the 1980s and 90s. It's a different time. But they went into schools, and they were schooled outside, and they visited family in the weekends. It wasn't closed, and there were professionals coming from outside and to do workshops in the community. So it was a very, very open environment.
And that's where training comes in. So when I talk about training, it's training those people. I can't stipulate enough that the education of those people who are in positions where they could help children is absolutely crucial. And when you talk about mandatory reporting, one of the things that myself and the team at Safeguarding Children call for is actually mandatory training, so that when people see children, wherever they go, opportunistically, or if they're working with them intensively, if it's a GP appointment, children going to school, that those people are trained in how to recognise and respond to child abuse and neglect. Now, anybody can read a list of what physical abuse looks like, emotional abuse looks like, but I'm talking about proper training, where it really goes into the nuances of what abuse looks like. It really looks at the life that children lead in the day and age now. When I go into organisations and they've got policies, it's as though the children are living in the 1950s. It doesn't actually reflect the lives of children now. And one of the things that you see, there is no almost nothing about spiritual abuse. It seems as though it's something that's not actually considered. So I'm calling for anybody and everybody who works with children to have high quality training in safeguarding and child protection. And that includes things like training in grooming. What does grooming look like? What does sexual abuse look like in depth? What does neglect look like? What are different types of neglect? Because there are many different types of neglect. And I'm sure the children in Centrepoint all experienced neglect in some form.
Without a doubt, that was just widespread neglect.
Medical neglect, supervisory neglect, all those different things. So it's really deep diving into those areas as well, so that people understand the world that the child's in and the child's life. And so when they have contact with the child and they get that gut instinct, because gut instinct is really important. I remember one of my lecturers at university said that there were more brain cells in your stomach than there are in the brain of a dog. And I think my dog's really clever. She can do tricks. So if my stomach is just as capable as my dog, then I am really, really going to trust my gut instincts. And if they're trained to understand that and trained to understand how precious childhood is and the impact on children of abuse and neglect, and the trauma that can cause and the long-term damage that can cause to the adult who that child will become, I think that there will be a better chance of children being protected even in situations where they are involved in a cult. I would call them being passengers, because they definitely are passengers in that situation. They're not, they're not driving the situation, and somebody has got to step up and speak up and take action to protect them. I'm not sure whether the current system in New Zealand is set up for such situations where there is spiritual abuse. I'm not sure whether anybody has ever put a report of concern in for spiritual abuse. That would be interesting. So also our statutory agencies have got to be trained as well. It's not just the people on the front line, our children's workers, it's the statutory agencies that need to be trained to understand those aspects as well. And our health workers, because health is so important. I always say that if a social worker, a statutory social worker knocked on my door, I would, or particularly if I knew they were coming, my house would just be wonderful. We'd have cookies baking, we'd be doing Play-Doh, everybody would be like looking really happy, because that's what you do. Whereas health workers, they see the real world. They see the situations of the children, because people accept health workers more than they do social workers or statutory workers. They're more likely to be their real selves. So for me, I call out to the Ministry of Health to really, really equip your health workers, particularly your primary health workers, really equip them to be able to recognise and respond to child abuse and neglect, all forms of it. All forms of it. If you look at the response after the death of Victoria Climbié, it was the health sector that actually stepped up, and that's where the work that I did in the child protection and safeguarding space was in health. And when I came to New Zealand 16 years ago, I thought that the UK had mandatory reporting, and when I started working here, I learned that the UK didn't have mandatory reporting. And that made me think, well, why did I think that there was mandatory reporting? And the reason for that was the fact that I was so well trained, and I was so aware of the policies, and there was an expectation that you reported.
Yes.
And it took me a long time to get my head around that mandatory reporting still isn't in the UK. So there needs to be investment. The government need to invest in this workforce. And I'm not talking about the crisis workforce. I'm talking about what I would describe as universal services, those frontline services that see children every day before the problem arises. They're our eyes and ears on the ground, and they're the people that can pick it up. And I think that, in New Zealand, we've got a 25-year strategy to reduce family violence and sexual violence. Absolutely fantastic, Caroline, but how many childhoods are 25 years? How many thousand days are 25 years? How many generations of children before we actually get our act together as a country? And a lot of that strategy is focused on adults. It's focused on adult violence. It's focused on sexual violence between adults. In fact, when I read the strategy, I think children were mentioned 33 times. And so Safeguarding Children have worked very hard at a government level to get children included more. And you'll be pleased to know that we've got them to include abuse within religious organisations as well within that strategy. So online abuse, and also abuse within faith sector and religious organisations. But as you say, not all cults are faith-based. But we have made a difference. Members of my team have been working with the government to actually get those aspects in. So it's those types of things that give me hope. But as a country, we need to do more. We need to do more.
We absolutely need to do more, because, like we have talked about some closed organisations, cults, that hardly anyone comes across those kids. But then there are others like Centrepoint where lots of people come across them. And it is, I think you're right, what you said before, like when it comes to very closed religious cultic type organisations, whether they're religious or not, at some point they usually hit the health sector.
Yeah.
They might not hit the educational sector. They might not go to sports. They might not turn up in other environments that children often end up, but they do end up some point in the health system, even if it's only briefly. So
as an ex-midwife, midwives have a massive role, because if people don't want to engage with the health services for whatever reason, they generally do engage with midwives. So they've got a massive role, whether they are equipped to actually take up that role, whether they are supported, whether they feel capable of doing it, whether it compromises their professional role with their clients. That to me is immaterial. They are frontline professionals and they have a key role. I know as an ex-midwife, the woman is your client, not the baby, but I can't actually accept that you know. So to me, it's those, not the crisis workers. And I know at the moment the government are putting lots of training or planning training for crisis workers. So these are the response people. But if we're talking about prevention, it needs to be the universal workers that actually, in my opinion, need to be trained.
I agree with you. So we've run out of time, and I want to give you an opportunity to say any sort of final words that you haven't had any opportunity to say now. For instance, I'd love you to tell us where we can go to get some training for any organisation we're connected to, because I think
So Safeguarding Children is a registered charity. We started in 2011. 3 nurses and a detective from the child protection team in Nelson started Safeguarding Children just because we realised that there was a desperate need for training, helping people to recognise and respond to child abuse and neglect. And it just grew. The training that we did, we thought it was a one-off, and here we are 15 years later. Next year is 15 years. We've gone from volunteers through to an organisation with a team of people, and we work nationally and internationally, believe it or not. So we've got a whole range of training as a charity. We're absolutely dedicated to providing training. We would really love to do it free of charge. We'd really love to have some government funding, but that ain't coming anytime soon. So we find other ways of actually getting the training to people, and we keep the cost as low as possible. And well before COVID, we decided that one of the ways of doing that was to have online training. So we started doing online training e-learning courses in about 2017. And we've got e-learning courses and webinars, and we also do face-to-face training. They're all on our website, which is www.safeguardingchildren, all one word, .org.nz. And there's some free training on there. There's some resources. So go and have a look. And all the aspects of that essential training that I've spoken about is on there. And also on the 8th of September through to the 14th, it's Child Safeguarding Week. So the theme of Child Safeguarding Week this year, every year we have a different theme, is parenting in a digital world. So I encourage listeners to go to our website and find the e-learning course that's about parenting in a digital world, but also you can sign up for Child Safeguarding Week. We've got a different website for that. That's childsafeguardingweek.org.nz, and there's lots of resources on there. There'll be podcasts, resources, free e-learning courses, and lots of other information about keeping our children and young people safe online.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. I feel so privileged to have had this conversation, and I feel encouraged to know that you're a champion and advocate for this work, and for the kid that I was when I was in such an organisation. It's nice to know that there are people like you doing this work for children who are there now. So.
And there's lots of people like me, Caroline, and that's the thing. There are lots of people that care, and they care deeply, and they care passionately. And for me, if they just had the training and they were able to feel as though they could do something and they knew what to do, that would make the difference to the lives of children like you.
Would change that culture, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So one step at a time. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Willow. And
All right.
We'll see you another day.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, we're back together, Liz and Lindy. It's lovely to see you guys again, and I really want to hear what you had to say about my conversation with Willow Duffy. Any thoughts?
Wow, yes. I just think I am so encouraged. I'm so thankful to have people like them working in New Zealand. Like, oh my goodness, it's such a massive area. It's so important. It's overwhelming. And yeah, I just come away going, oh, thank goodness there's people like her with her passion and expertise at work, because yeah, Overall, while the conversation was encouraged, I was also just pretty gutted to be reminded of things like that there's no mandatory reporting in New Zealand, that the legislation is so weak, that there's still so many loopholes out there for children. And as the news reminds us, way too often in New Zealand, there are still children that are constantly falling through the gaps and being abused and being killed right here in New Zealand. And like, really, that reality is absolutely shocking. And yeah, so people like Willow and the work she does is absolutely crucial. Yeah.
Yeah, they're working really hard. Just sort of got on their website after you'd had the conversation to find out a bit more about Willow and safeguarding children, and just an incredible number of training sessions that they've actually provided across this country is fantastic. I guess as far as content goes, something that it keeps coming back to me and it's been playing in my mind was the story she related about the girl in the UK and how she'd had over 120 interactions with people and professionals who could have at any point recognised there was something really wrong and acted and didn't act. And then it was a couple of people from the public, but literally this child was dying, like it was death day. And that's terrible, because there are a lot of warning signs before someone gets to death day. That shows us we actually have a collective responsibility to do more and do better and to know what to do.
And there's something about the power of the social organisation or organism that the individual who has suspicion is bound by. And that is the bit that I guess we don't understand. And what we're wanting to sort of explore here is, what is it about the group that takes away those instincts to protect children?
Well, I think if you're talking coercively controlling groups, it becomes clear the instinct to protect your children is not a value. It's not something that's fostered. And if you've got second and third generation, they don't even know what those words mean, Kaz.
I thought it was really interesting how she pointed out just these various layers here, but the thing, from our context, when we're thinking about a semi-closed group or a closed group, there's this question of, who are the people inside it? And then who are the people who interact with it, like the professionals that, children from that group may go to an outside school, or they may see an outside GP. And then, like in the case of Victoria, there's the people like a taxi driver or a neighbour who might be interacting with them. And just to hear Willow talking about, that all those people are important. And so it's not, that you're sort of trying to work to educate people inside a group, like say it's a religious organisation, encouraging that religious organisation to have their own child safety training. But then, there's this crucial role of just continuing to educate the wider public, so that, the neighbours or the taxi driver or whoever it might be, that they recognise what the signs of child abuse look like, and just how crucial actually those people are. I think she said at one point something about that it's often those people who step in and who are actually the ones who, do the reporting, not necessarily the ones inside professional networks. So it just emphasises the importance of the public being educated as well, right?
Well, it's picking up the cues, because it's possible that she took the child to church and told people that boiling water had accidentally fallen on her, and people just gullibly believe it. The problem is that any right-minded citizen should have seen that child should have been getting medical care to treat the burns. So it's not just about the fact that something happened, it's about the aftercare that wasn't at the level that we would expect in society. So there was something about that group that obviously they had some beliefs around healthcare, that the member actually thought it was appropriate to take the child along in various states of, neglect. And for whatever reason, that it wasn't going to ring any alarm bells for these people. And so I think it's about the beliefs of the group. But often, remember, no one likes to interfere in these groups. Inside these groups, your role is to affirm the whole community and the whole group, and the interest isn't on the individual. And it's hard to actually step out of line and do anything that looks like reporting, whether it's not just reporting to social services, it's reporting to health. It's even just telling another family member that perhaps there could be a way they could care for their children better. That's really hard to do within these sorts of groups too.
Yeah, and I was describing how in the interview how often people at Centrepoint intervened or tried to intervene and got shut down. Really, really targeted. and extremely punished. And there, I seem to recall there was something, because Bert Potter did communicate his ideologies about sex with children quite strongly and vocally. You know, he wasn't hiding it. It was very out there. And I remember him using, I don't remember, but I remember hearing that he used some literature that was published at the time that was very controversial about child sexual interactions. It was very controversial, and he used that as a way of furthering his ideology and suppressed some of the instincts of the adults. And then there was a key person, Barry Leslie, who did some of her own personal research on this, and she discovered that no, in fact, this was not the case, and opened her eyes up to the possibility that there might be some harm happening, and as a result got some social workers to come and do some education in the community. And that really did, it created enormous I think it was around the time of the leading up to the abuse trials of the adults who were ended up being convicted. So I might have the order a little bit wrong, but the point was it created enormous disruption in the community. There were adults who wanted to hear, because they were hearing from their own children that they weren't comfortable with what was going on. So something did start to shift in the community. Mm-hmm. It created enormous disruption because it went away against that ideology.
That's why cults don't like information coming from the outside, because they're concerned about the disruption.
Yeah, and Kaz, just picking up on that word there, you said about that, you know, Bert wasn't hiding his philosophy there. And I think that's another really interesting layer here with the question of child safety, because Willow used that term as well about Victoria. She said she was not a hidden child. And I thought, fascinating concept again that I guess we're dealing with here is sometimes child abuse is hidden or in an extremely closed group with very limited access to the outside world. You know, and for our listeners, Gloriavale is not the only group in New Zealand like that. We do have some small commune type other situations, and definitely some family environments that are incredibly restricted with their access to outside worlds. But those, children in some of those groups could be classified perhaps as more hidden, and the abuse more hidden. Whereas, then there's these other kinds of abuse, including philosophies and people who are not hiding at all the abuse or the harmful philosophies and ideologies, and yet somehow the abuse can still continue and flourish. So that's a real challenge when it's not even hidden.
Well, at a point, it wasn't hidden in the commune, but I think still they were discouraged from sharing the reality to the teachers that they came across. So I don't think the teachers kind of knew the kids were getting sexually interfered with, or if they did, it was suspicion rather than confirmed. You know, the response at the school was to segregate the kids from the other kids. So it was like, well, we don't want our children, our other outside children, to catch what the Centrepoint kids might have. So it became, the kids actually became, rather than being protected by the teachers in the school that they were attending, they were ostracized and isolated. I hope that 2025 is a bit better than 1985.
I would think so. Look at the amount of child safety information that's out there, and what we know now about development, attachment. Something that really struck me about what Willow spoke about is when she goes and does training, and I'm not sure if she was talking particularly about closed groups or generally, she starts right back at thinking about childhood and the things that are needed and necessary, and then she talks about the development. And so by the time she's finished with her training, she's actually tried to move hearts and minds. And so she said she relied on at least one person in each organisation to, have an understanding or have a real desire to implement child protection. That can be hard inside a closed community group where you get your orders from the top and everyone defers to the leader. I think in the context of, say, a Gloriavale scenario, I know that people inside Gloriavale have been impacted by some interfacing with health practitioners who have helped them understand that process, and it has been illuminating for them, but they have still been living in a place where there's restrictions around how you can have policies, you can even have an understanding that you need them. It doesn't actually mean that you have the full capacity and freedom to go ahead and do the right thing when you have concerns.
Yeah, and I wrote that down, that line where she said, she really emphasized it, but she said culture trumps policy every time. And I just thought that was such a key line, and quite a heavy one actually for anybody who cares about this stuff and any organisation to sit with around just going, yeah, the policy literally means nothing. It's just a piece of paper if the culture doesn't completely back up this value of the child and their rights and their safety, just how incredibly important that is to be working to shift culture, and how that, yeah, it does often begin with an individual who genuinely connects with their own childhood value and who then decides to care for these little vulnerable human beings.
Find in the context of Glory Vale, a lot of those ones are families that have left or chose to leave. They actually cared so much and realised what wasn't happening, and so they've left to be able to do that. So I worry that there are less of those kind of people in that context now than there were, but there's obviously clearly work to be done, and it's worth doing. And I think probably in most instances you would have an organisation that has invited you to come in because they really do want to do better. I'm not sure if closed communities actually invite child safety experts in. I think they get sort of foisted on them through government intervention or people looking at them. And I see that in the sphere of Glory Vale. There was disruption because there was a lot of abuse and there was pressure and court. And I feel like some of those kind of groups are in there, but there has been a reluctance, it hasn't been a true response begging, we've got a real problem, come and help, rather someone else saying, you've got a real problem and we need to come in. And that might make a difference how these things are received.
It makes all the difference because culture still trumps policy. If you can't hear the cries of your children and hear their suffering.
Well, shall we finish with that quote? Culture trumps policy. And cultural change takes a very long time, and it takes people with courage and bravery to upend a system where children and the individual usually matter very little. What is it? Cults dispense with your existence, and that includes not just throwing you out when things go bad. It means not meeting your needs along the way. You're just dispensable. Yeah. Well, what do you reckon? Shall we wrap it up here today and thank Willow for her time with CARES and bringing to our attention the needs we have in New Zealand to look for better legislative requirements to safeguard children, and to encourage our local listeners, the people just walking out there on the streets today listening to this podcast, that we all have a collective responsibility to look after children, to care and to report and support. So maybe we should all head off to some training sessions and see how we can implement them in all our spheres of life. Thanks again to Plains Media for their support of this podcast. Make sure you get to our social media platforms, like us, share us around, and leave us some comments. Let us know what you'd like us to talk about. So we'll be back again with Cult Chat really soon. Bye, everybody.
See you next time.
If anything in today's episode was difficult or upsetting for you and you would like to talk to somebody, we encourage our New Zealand listeners to free call or text 1737 for support from a trained counsellor. Or you might like to visit the resources section of the Olive Leaf Network website, where you can find a range of organisations and resources that might be able to support you. We would also like to remind you that the views and thoughts and opinions that have been expressed in this program are the speakers alone, and Cult Chat does not necessarily endorse or share them.